Here we go. Johnny Carson. Great Johnny Carson. Okay, well, good evening. Welcome back. Hope that this is going well for you so far. I'm hoping that you're learning a little bit of something. I know I am. And that this is helping you appreciate more the love of God for us in His passion, death, and resurrection. So tonight we're doing lesson 3. Last week we had Jesus who had been arrested, was before the Jewish authorities. We had the Jewish trial or interrogation, depending which text we were looking at, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. We had Peter's denial and Judas's death. So this week, we're going to have a little bit more of the geography, again, just to help you get a visual on how this flows. We'll talk a little bit about the kind of trial that Jesus went through before Pilate, and then I'll make some comments on the text. Okay. So to remind you on the geography here, this is the model of the old city of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. This right here is the Holy of Holies, the temple. This is the court of the faithful. This is the court of the Gentiles. This area around here is called the Temple Mount area. These are retaining walls down here and all the way around. Remember, it's the retaining wall on that side that we call the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. It's still standing. It's the only thing left of all of this in Jerusalem today. Over here is the Fortress Antonia. We'll talk about that again. Back over here is Herod's palace. We'll talk about that. Over in this corner here is Caiaphas' house. And then remember, here is the Kidron Valley coming down, and then coming up the other side is the Mount of Olives. Okay. So remember, Jesus is arrested at the Mount of Olives, at the base of the Mount of Olives, it was the Garden of Gethsemane. He's presumably taken across the Kidron Valley through a gate somewhere along in here, through these neighborhoods and stuff, to Caiaphas' house. This is all on foot. Over to Caiaphas' house. And then we know that Jesus is taken to the Praetorium. We'll talk about where the Praetorium is in just a minute. Remember, this was Caiaphas' house, and right now it stands that church of St. Peter and Gallicantu, which is St. Peter where the cock crowed. And we said there was that monument there of Peter's 3 denials. Okay? So just to kind of reorient you to some of the geography here. So this is Caiaphas' house in that model. It doesn't obviously stand today. And this is what's standing there now, St. Peter and Gallicantu, this church. Okay? It's right on the edge of the old city of Jerusalem. And then this is the model of what Herod's palace. So all of this, these towers, all of this wall, these ramparts here, all of this is all part of Herod's palace. Just for orientation, here's the temple again. So now we're looking at from the back side, the other side of the temple. And then here's that Fortress Antonia again. Okay? So just kind of to reorient you to what this area, where we're talking about in relationship to each other and this sort of thing. We're going to talk about Praetorium in a few minutes, but this is one possibility where the Praetorium was. This is the Fortress Antonia. Remember, this is the temple wall, that courtyard of the Gentiles. Okay, and so this is this is attached to the Temple Mount area. Okay, I put these two pictures up here too. Just to talk about for just a second, this is something that's been excavated in the old city. We're going to talk about the Lithostratos. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but this seems to be a candidate for what that stone pavement is that we're going to talk about. This has been excavated. There's markings on here that have to do with how the Romans guards would have processed and taken prisoners, and what they would have done with the prisoners that they had in their guard, in their custody. So this is the Lithostratos. And then this here is called the Homo Arch. Any Latin scholars? Homo. Behold the man. Behold the man. So it's interesting that the arch actually comes up here and comes back down here, but they built a building attached to it here that goes up further than where the arch does. So that's why it doesn't look like an even arch, because they built this building after this arch was established. And they just built the building where they wanted to. So if you go to Jerusalem, you go to the old city, you'll see there's a lot of things they just built where they wanted to. It doesn't make some sense sometimes. So that's the Homo Arch. Okay. Near there on the wall, there's these inscriptions, and we'll come back to those in a second. They're in Latin. I'll kind of tell you, but they're marking where the spot where Jesus was arrested and tortured before his sentence of death. And there's a chapel right near there, right inside that area, where Jesus is shown in this painting receiving his cross. And we'll talk about that again. I just want to give you some orientation to these markers that are in that area where we think all of this took place that we're talking about tonight. Okay? So just a couple of orientation things there. Okay. So tonight what I want to talk about first is some background on the Roman trial. So for the attorneys in the house, you're going to see that this is probably very well understood, that it's not a real trial, but it's what we call the Roman trial because, and I'll talk about in a second why it's different. So who did the Romans put on trial? So when we talk about that, we have to talk about, there's different categories of people that the Romans would have bothered themselves with putting on trial and executing judgment. No pun intended. First of all, there's leaders who take on the role of a leader even if it's not given to them. So they take on a role because they've decided to embrace a particular role that they think they have the charisms for. Well, it doesn't seem to be that Jesus qualifies in that because Jesus wasn't given a specific spirit at the time of his public ministry to do a particular role. Jesus has his role because he's the Son of God. So he didn't take on any persona. He didn't be anybody other than who he is. And so that would not have been a reason for the Romans to put him on trial. Then we have Messiahs. By the way, Messiah is a Hebrew word. Anybody know what the Greek version of that is? Jesus the Christ. So Messiah means anointed one in Hebrew. That's what Christ means in Greek. So Jesus is the anointed one. There were many people who claimed to be the anointed one. But you have to kind of remember what was expected at that time of a Messiah. What they expected is somebody who would be anointed, like a particular shepherd boy centuries earlier, who ended up taking on a role of leadership, public civil leadership. Sound familiar? About 1,000 years before Jesus, somebody was a shepherd boy who was anointed, and I'm hearing David, yes. Okay? So what they expected was a Davidic type person. Somebody coming in like David did, on a white charger, waving either a slingshot or a sword in the air to kick the Romans out of town. That's what they're expecting in the line of Messiah. Why would the Romans care? We don't want to be kicked out of town. So the Romans would try messiahs, so-called messiahs. Okay? But Jesus doesn't fit that type. Jesus is not riding into town on a charger, waving a sword or a slingshot in the air. So the Romans don't see him as a Messiah type, so they're not interested in dealing with him because he doesn't claim that. Okay? Would-be kings, people who thought themselves to be the king, thus deposing Caesar as the rightful ruler of the area, right? So the Romans would obviously be concerned about that. But Jesus doesn't fit that model. What does he say in the scriptures? My kingdom is not here. If my kingdom were here, my angels would be, my people would be fighting for me. As it is, my kingdom is not here. Jesus is not claiming kingship. What does he say with that? When somebody asks, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? What does he say? Render to Caesar belongs to Caesar. Render to God what belongs to God. Does that sound like somebody who's trying to take the kingship away from Caesar? Of course not. And at one other point in the scriptures, Jesus goes off because he thinks the people are going to crown him king and he wants to escape and not be crowned king. Does that sound like somebody who wants to be king? Of course not. So the Romans aren't interested in trying him because he's claiming kingship, because he's not. Okay? False prophets and charlatans. There was a lot of false prophets at that time. Jesus warns about listening to false prophets. Jesus is not fitting the model of the false prophets at the time. There were plenty of them at the time. But Jesus doesn't behave in the ways that they do. So the Romans don't equate him with these charlatans, as they call them. So he's not being put on trial for that. Bandits. This gets a little technical, but there's a Greek word, listes. Transliterated L-E-S-T-E-S, listes. Which some people translate as bandits. Okay, and Raymond Brown, who's like my expert that I go to, he calls them, translates that word as bandits. Has Jesus stolen anything? No, Jesus is not a bandit. So the Romans don't, there's nobody making an accusation. It's interesting, they treat him like a bandit, they treat him like a leastes. He's crucified with 2 leastes, but there's no evidence that he's a leastes at all. So the Romans aren't interested in trying him for that. There's another word, sicarii, S-I-C-A-R-I-I, sicarii. Literally translates into a knife wielder. Somebody who goes around stabbing people. Okay? Do we have any indication that Jesus is going around stabbing anybody? No, in fact, earlier on when they want to pick up swords, he says, those who live by the sword die by the sword. Is that what a sicarii would say? Of course not. And then finally, the zealots that we talked about last week was that religious group that wanted to purify Israel by any means necessary. So they become politically active and violent in their desire to purify Israel for the people of God, for the people of the covenant. They act fanatically without mercy, and of course, Jesus doesn't fit that model. So these are the kinds of people the Romans would put on trial, and Jesus doesn't fit any of them, and they know that. So there has to be a different direction that we go here with this trial. So first of all, it's not the normal people. Second thing to talk about is, who is this guy Pontius Pilate? He's the guy that flew the plane in the flight into Egypt, right? Sorry. I just want to see who was awake still. I've lost half of you already. So Pontius Pilate. So he is the prefect, he is the governor, he is the person appointed by the Romans to have control of this land. Okay? He is the praetor. That's where we get that word praetorium, the place where the praetor stays. We'll talk about the praetorium again in a minute. So he's the person appointed to the highest level of leadership on behalf of the Romans in this area. He rules from 26 to 36 AD. Why is that important? When you start trying to place the timeline for when this is happening to the Lord, you can see 26 to 36 for Pilate, 18 to 36, if I remember correctly, for Caiaphas. So you can see where the overlap is. And so if Caiaphas is high priest and Pilate's the governor, Jesus has to be crucified during that window between those 2 time periods. This is how they narrow things down. They start looking at all these other pieces of evidence. Unusually, Palestine is very stable at this time. There's not a lot of riots. There's not a lot of revolutions. There's no wars. So the Romans aren't being attacked by other countries, other empires of the time. It's a very stable time in Israel's history, in the territory of Israel's history. And that's unusual. And really, ever since then, it has been unusual too. But it was a fairly, from the other accounts of the time, the other histories outside the scriptures, there's every indication it was an unusually stable time. So how is Pilate seen? So when you look at the Christian scriptures, when you look at other sources, when you look at Jewish historians, Roman historians, when you look at all the evidence, how is Pilate really seen? Well, it's interesting because they're diametrically opposed views. You've got people over here that thinks he's saint incarnate, and you got people over here that thinks he's worthy of sainthood. They're really opposed. In the Gospels, to start there, Mark is not very flattering of Pilate, as you'll see as you saw in the text. The other 3, Matthew, Luke, and John, seem to want to paint Pilate in a slightly better light than Mark does. And again, when you look at the text, you'll see that when you compare them across. St. Peter, in his references to him in other places in the scripture, calls him an unjust judge. So Peter is in that group of people over here that don't have much concern, much regard for Pilate. Yeah, he was a judge, and he was certainly unjust. He was a bad guy. On the other side, interestingly enough, there's Christian writings of the early Christian era that are very favorable to Pilate and to his wife, the one that Matthew mentions in his text. In fact, the Eastern Orthodox and some Eastern Catholics say that Pilate's wife's name was Claudia Procula, I think is what it was, and she's got a saint day on the calendar. So she's Saint Procula for the Eastern Orthodox and some Eastern Catholics. Okay? Pilate himself is regarded by the Coptic Church, which is the church that was centered out of Egypt, as Saint Pontius Pilate. So the Egyptians of the early Christian era name him a saint on their calendar. So you can see vast differences in, by the way, the Christians of the era regarded Pontius Pilate. You can see it in the texts, not as dramatic, but when you look outside the text of the scriptures, you can see great differences in how
So
Pilate...
did he commit suicide, or was he beheaded from those sources?
There's some of each.
Okay.
There's some of each, yeah. And the suicide wasn't necessarily even a suicide of despair,
No,
as much as a cultural suicide.
A Roman
A
rebellion.
Roman, exactly.
A Roman rebellion.
It was a cultural thing, as the appropriate thing to do when you're near the end of your life. Yes, different culture, different time. I'm not saying the Christian culture. I'm saying the Roman culture.
It was honorable for a soldier to do that.
In some people, yeah, that's just a culture that was the appropriate thing to do.
And I was surprised to find out that they were called saints of the Eastern Church and what you just said.
Yeah, yeah. Let's see. So some people hold to this idea that because Pilate did some bad things, he fell from favor with the Roman leadership. So some people say that he fell out of favor because he did some really bad things. There are other people who say that he wanted to release Jesus, and you kind of see this a little bit in the text, especially in John's Gospel account, but he was afraid to do so. So the views of Pontius Pilate are all over the board. And a lot of it is based on history, but it's different versions of the history. Like Jack was saying, there's times when he's regarded highly because there's people who say he converted to Christianity. There are other people who say, no, he was a really bad guy. There's all different kinds of degrees in between. But that's important that you know the history, so you don't just assume that Pontius Pilate was X. Well, there's plenty of people who say that he was Y. So it's just something to keep in mind when you look at the history outside of the scriptures. Even in the scriptures, as I said, Mark versus Matthew, Luke, and John give you a different portrayal. So that's Pilate who runs the trial.
But he specifically mentioned in the creed that he crucified under Pontius Pilate. So
right, that's an English translation of a Latin prayer that was originally written in Greek. So that's the first thing, to always look at those things that we look at, is to make sure that we understand we're getting an English translation of a Latin prayer that was translated from Greek. And when we get back to Pilate, we'll talk a little bit more when I talk about the text that you studied for tonight. We'll talk about what the scriptures finally say about him. Okay, so we talked about the kind of trial, we talked about who's running the trial, what we have to talk about is where is the trial. And so we know that the trial, according to the scriptures, happens at the Praetorium. What we don't have agreement on from the historians and the Bible scholars is where's the Praetorium? Okay, so there's two theories. Now remember, what are we talking about? We're talking about Pontius Pilate. I said last time, where's his real Praetorium? Caesarea Philippi. For those of you who've been there, you know that's a very wealthy city, very glamorous city, very important city on the Mediterranean Sea where Israel hits the Mediterranean. That's where he really lived, Caesarea Philippi. However, because Jerusalem is such an important place, he has to have a residence, if you will, in Jerusalem. So where does he stay when he's in Jerusalem? Remember, praetor means the governor of the troops, the person in charge of the troops. So, one argument is for Herod's palace. Okay? So, we know that from history, this was a fortress, there's walls around it. Okay? So it is a secure place. There were two garrisons in the city, two sets of Roman soldiers in the city. One at the Fortress Antonia, which we'll talk about in a second, and one stationed at Herod's palace. So you can make the argument he stayed with his troops. Where his troops stayed? Well, some of them are staying at Herod's palace. So it's possible that Pilate stayed at Herod's palace. Okay. We also know that this is a lot nicer accommodations than the Fortress Antonia. So if you have the choice of where you want to stay, are you going to stay where it's more, Spartan? Or are you going to stay where it's more luxurious? So probably Pilate stayed where it was more luxurious and more comfortable. Josephus Flavius, that I mentioned a few weeks ago, a Jewish historian, says that there was a lithostrotos, a stone pavement, Greek word for stone pavement, at the palace. And even in the text you see references to the palace. Okay? So there's some reasons, some very good reasons to think that where this trial took place, the praetorium, was at Herod's palace. Okay? That's one school of thought. The other school of thought is no, it took place at the Fortress Antonia. That was the praetorium. Why? Because it was a castle that was converted to barracks for Roman soldiers. So it had some accommodation for living space, and there's soldiers here too. And so where would the praetor be? With his troops. Okay? So that's another argument for that. Josephus again calls this not the palace, but a tower and a fortress. Remember what I said last week? One of the ways that the Romans had control over the Jewish people, I shouldn't say that word, the religion of Israel was through the high priest. Remember what the high priest have to do in order to offer sacrifice once a year? He had to put on the special robes that were worn once a year to go into the Holy of Holies. When he took those off, where were they stored? At the Fortress Antonia. So that's one of the ways the Romans had control over the people in Palestine, was by keeping the robes of the high priest. So those were kept here at the Fortress Antonia. So we have a good argument for the Fortress Antonia being the place of the praetorium. I'm going to proceed with this being the praetorium. And the main reason why is, who's been to Israel? Anybody? Okay. If you walk the original Stations of the Cross, the Via Dolorosa as it's called in Latin, if you walk the original Stations of the Cross, guess which part of town they begin in? By the Fortress Antonia. So there's a long, long tradition of walking the Stations of the Cross, walking the route that Jesus went to his crucifixion, starting in this part of the town by the Fortress Antonia, not by Herod's palace. So again, there's good arguments on both sides. I'm going to lean on the side of Fortress Antonia just because the Stations of the Cross begin there. Okay? So you can pick whichever one you want. It's not divine revelation. It's just what's the evidence pointing to. If you look at this, and I'll talk in a second, I'll talk more about the Via Dolorosa.
Where would Barabbas have been? Where's the jail or the place where the prisoners would have been staying?
There's arguments for barracks by the palace and barracks by Fortress Antonia. And of course, they can cart Jesus all over town. They can cart Barabbas around town too. It's a good question. Trying to pin it down, it's good thinking. Good detective. So what kind of trial was it? Well, here's the thing. So you've got the Romans who are really in charge, right? But they know that one of the ways to keep peace in Palestine is to work with these religious dudes. The high priest, the chief priest, their Sanhedrin, to work with them. Because antagonizing all of them is just going to make your job of occupiers harder. So they do have agreements with how they're going to work with the people who live in Palestine and the leadership in Palestine. I'm trying to stay away from the word Jew for a reason. So the people in Palestine. So one of the things that appears to have been an agreement, again from sources outside the scriptures as well, is that crimes that were capital crimes would go to the Romans, except those of a religious nature. So, if somebody's caught in adultery, the Romans couldn't care less. If you knew about Roman morality at this time, they don't care about adultery. Okay? So if there's an adultery, what does the law of Moses say though? Stoning. Okay? That's a capital offense, being caught in the act of adultery, as we know from the woman caught in adultery in John's Gospel, right? So the Romans would allow the local authorities to condemn and execute somebody for that religious crime. What's the other big religious crime that somebody could commit that the local authorities would have an issue with, but the Romans could care less about? Blasphemy. Okay? So blasphemy would be another thing that the Romans would turn over to the Jewish people and say, that's your law. If you want to kill somebody because of blasphemy, you couldn't care less, go right ahead. There was an agreement between the Romans and the local authorities that if it was a religious capital crime, go ahead and take care of it yourselves. But if it's any other kind of capital crime, we'll take care of it. Okay? So the Jewish trial versus the Roman trial. If you remember going back to last week, in the Jewish trial / interrogation, only in Mark and Matthew was there an explicit death sentence in the text. Okay? Matthew and John also have Pilate sitting on a judgment seat in the text, as if he's passing his own judgment. It's almost like if the sentence is already given, no judge has to go to the bench, right? But Pilate does go to the bench. So why does he go to the bench? Because it seems to be he's giving his own judgment in Matthew and John. John's text seems to refuse to accept the local authorities' determination of guilt, and that's why there's a trial before Pilate. But here's another interesting thing, and you notice if you remember Acts of the Apostles and what happens to St. Paul. Jesus is not a Roman citizen. Okay? Jesus is not a Roman citizen. So he doesn't have rights. Okay? So because he doesn't have rights, Pilate doesn't have to give him a trial at all. He doesn't owe him that. He's not a Roman citizen. He can just say, yeah, I don't like the way you part your hair, take him away and crucify him. So he doesn't have to. So if it doesn't look like a trial like we think of, now remember, what's American law rooted in? British law. What's British law rooted in? Roman law. So a capital crime in our time, there'd be a trial, right? And there would have been in those days too, if the person was entitled to one who had rights. Jesus doesn't have those rights. So you don't see calling forth witnesses. You don't see a jury of peers. You don't see a triumvirate judging the case. You don't see anything like that. You don't see it going to the emperor. St. Paul, who's a Roman citizen, when he's getting ready to be killed, he demands his rights to be tried by the emperor because he's a Roman citizen. And the only Roman citizen can be condemned by death, it had to be by the emperor. So Jesus doesn't have those rights, so Pilate doesn't owe him a formal trial. And so you don't really see a formal trial in the Roman sense because there's no reason that they have to do that. So the charge against Jesus is made. The charge is those claiming kingship were guilty of sedition, and that was punishable by the Romans for crucifixion. But that's why Pilate asks the question, so are you a king? Because if he says, yes, I'm a king, I can charge him with sedition, because he's not the king, Caesar's the king, and we can crucify him. But we'll see in the text what Jesus says to that. All four Gospels, Jesus never answers the question directly. He doesn't say, yes, I'm a king, and he doesn't say, no, I'm not. The crowds become hostile, and there's lots of evidence in the time of this trial, this so-called trial, that a crowd could sway a verdict. So crowds were instrumental, not as a jury, but by acclamation. If the crowds were all demanding death, sometimes we see that the authors of histories at this period are saying that the crowd swayed the ruler. Especially in those cases where the authors wanting to say the ruler is weak. He let the crowd sway them. We kind of talk that way today. You know, that's like, I know the right thing to do, but because it's not popular, the crowd doesn't want me to do it, I'm not doing it. So at that time too, there's extra canonical literature that says crowds would often sway a verdict in a trial. And so it's not surprising that the people who wrote the Gospels would say the crowds are swaying Pilate to give the verdict that they want. Okay? I mentioned this yesterday, and I'll mention it now too. The reason I'm stumbling over the word Jewish is because it doesn't really mean, in the text of the scriptures, what we think it means. When we say Jewish, we usually mean either people A, who belong to a particular religion, the religion of Abraham and Moses, okay? Or we mean people who are ethnically from what we call today Israel. That's what we generally mean when we say Jewish. That's not what the texts mean when they say Jewish. Jewish, remember we're going from Aramaic and Hebrew to Greek to Latin to English. And along the line, Jewish stopped meaning what it originally meant. What it originally means is the people of Judea. Okay, so remember Israel. There's Galilee in the north, which goes up like towards where the Golan Heights are, Lebanon. Comes down south, hits Samaria. So we know the story about the Good Samaritan and Jesus talking about Samaritans. That's Samaria, that's in the middle. And then you've got Judea in the south. Jerusalem and Bethlehem are in Judea, Nazareth is in Galilee. So Jesus is called a Galilean because where does he grow up? Nazareth. Where was he born? He's born in Judea, in Bethlehem, land of Judah. So Jewish in these texts means people from Judea. Okay, so they're Judeans. But it gets, over the years, in translation, it gets changed into what we would say today is Jew. And that's what our text says. But they don't mean all the people of the religion of Abraham and Moses, and they don't mean all of the people who live in what we would call Israel. That's not what they mean. They mean the Judeans. So that's why I was stumbling over the word and trying to say the people of that area, the local people, because I was trying to stay away from using the word Jew, and it's kind of hard to do because all of our texts say Jew, but it's because it's a translation of a word that really originally meant Judeans. Okay, so when you read this, when you read Jews, read people in Judea. Okay, so moving into a reflection on the text that you were reading for tonight. So I divided the trial before Pilate into parts 1 and 2 because in some cases it's split up by another text in between. So that's why I'm talking about trial part 1 and then trial part 2. Okay. Mark and Matthew, as you saw in the text by the coloring, are almost identical throughout. Okay. So Mark and Matthew are pretty much saying the same thing. The question is asked, are you the king? Jesus says, you say so. Notice he doesn't say yes or no. The chief priests, remember who the chief priests are? In Matthew he adds, and the elders. So what you have here is a baby Sanhedrin, remember from last week? Chief priests are leaders from the priestly class. Elders are people from all those different groups. And so you have a baby Sanhedrin here. They accuse Jesus, but he doesn't answer. Pilate is amazed, Matthew says greatly amazed, because Pilate wants Jesus to defend himself. Not because he's got intellectual curiosity, he doesn't want to do it with this guy. Remember I said, there's no good grounds to do away with this guy. He doesn't fit any of those categories of the people who would normally come before him. So he doesn't want to crucify Jesus, he doesn't want to destroy Jesus, but he has to have Jesus say something to defend himself. Tell me that what these people are saying about you is not true. Okay? If you want to see an interesting reference to what is going on in this trial, it's Psalm 109 verses 2 and 3. Psalm 109 verses 2 and 3. Where King David, 1,000 years before this, is telling us the suffering one is surrounded by enemies who speak with lying tongues and who are encompassed with words of hate. Sounds like a pretty good prophecy there. The suffering one is surrounded by the enemies who speak with lying tongues and who are encompassed with words of hate. So that's Mark and Matthew, because they're almost the same. I'm lumping them together. Luke, slightly different. He has the chief priests and the crowds. Lucan literary device here. We're in the year of Luke, so the crowds in Luke are very important when they're not in Mark and Matthew. Because the crowds are usually the ones that are favorable to Jesus. If you read the rest of the Gospel of Luke, the crowds are always getting it, even when the leaders don't. He was winning over the crowds. The crowds were speaking marvelous about him. They were glorifying God because of him. But the leaders are trying to get rid of him. So the crowds in Luke's gospel is an important word because it's a word that's pointing to people who are usually in favor. It's the crowds when Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, what we call Palm Sunday. The crowds are favoring. They're shouting, Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna. This is great. It's the leaders that are trying to do with them and trying to tell the crowds to be quiet. So the crowds are usually very favorable, but now the crowds have shifted. The crowds have shifted, and they're against Jesus. There's a specific charge by the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. He's misleading the people. Is that a theological argument or now a political argument? It's a political argument. They've gone away from accusing him of something spiritual and religious like blasphemy. Now they're saying he's misleading the people by opposing taxes to Caesar. True or false? False. And by calling himself the Messiah, a king. Problem. He is the Messiah, but Messiah doesn't mean king. Messiah means anointed one. But they're playing on this word now, and they're taking that Davidic concept of Messiah, which Jesus is not the Davidic concept of Messiah. He's the true Messiah. He's the true anointed one of God. And calling him a king. So now again, they're making a political charge against him. Because the Romans aren't going to do away with him for a religious charge. Their only hope is to convince the Romans that he's guilty of some political crime. And Luke repeats this misleading, and then it becomes inciting. Well, we know what inciting means. He's not just misleading them intellectually, he's now pushing them to revolt. So they're trying to trump up these charges and make them sound even stronger and stronger as they go along, so the Romans will destroy him. We know, of course, these are false charges. It was chapter 20, verse 22, where he says, pay the taxes to Caesar. And there's lots of times in the Gospel of Luke where who is Jesus eating with? Tax collectors. Who do the tax collectors work for? The Romans. Does that sound like somebody who's trying to stop people from paying their taxes? He's hanging out with tax collectors. The local people hate the tax collectors because they're collaborating with the Romans. Here Jesus hangs out, so the locals hate Jesus because he hangs out with tax collectors. But the tax collectors are the very people that he's eating with. They work for the Romans. The Romans have a problem with that? Of course not. Are you following me on that line? Okay. So Pilate gives the first of 3 chances for Jesus to show his innocence. Another literary thing here in Luke, and you'll see this coming in the following weeks. 3 times there are people that Jesus appears in front of who have the opportunity to condemn him, but recognize his innocence. We're going to see it in a few minutes with Herod, that Herod recognizes innocence. The criminal on the cross, we'll see next week, recognizes Jesus' innocence. And the centurion at the cross recognizes Jesus' innocence. So Luke keeps putting those moments in there of reminding us of people who saw the truth because they were open. They had open eyes to see the truth. And Pilate appears to be maybe one of those in Luke's gospel as well, where he keeps trying to give Jesus every opportunity to be innocent. Because maybe he sees the truth that Jesus is innocent. Then we've got John. John is so full of irony here. Just so full of irony. So first of all, going back to the Praetorium, they refuse to go into the Praetorium. So presumably they're in this area, someplace in here. They refuse to go into the Praetorium. Why? Because if they enter the Praetorium, they'll be ritually unclean to celebrate the Passover. So entering a building, they're concerned about, that makes them ritually unclean. But they're not concerned about being ritually unclean for killing the Son of God. You get it? Mm-hmm. They think that that's going to make them ritually unclean, but killing Jesus is okay on false charges. You see the irony?
Father,
Yes.
but that's false witness. Isn't that one of their commandments? Not to have false.
Well, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's evil, yeah. But they're very obviously doing evil.
Right.
Yeah. And trying to kill an innocent man. Not to mention the Son of God. Because remember, this is John's gospel. Another irony. They want to avoid ritual impurities so they can celebrate and eat the Passover meal. So they want to eat the Passover meal, okay? And so in doing so, they demand the death of the Lamb of God. Now, this is all happening at noon on Friday. What else is happening at noon on Friday in Jerusalem?
Sacrifice.
The slaughtering of the lambs. They're going to be used for the Passover. So the lamb is being tried and condemned to death, the Lamb of God. At the same time, the lambs are being slaughtered for the Passover meal. Get it? This is John. This is the depths and the beauty of St. John, the Gospel according to John. The law does not allow them to put someone to death if it's a religious charge, so they have to make Jesus' charge a political charge. And what is happening must fulfill what Jesus said, because he's God. So everything is happening according to what he said. Last irony I want to point out here in John's text at this part is, if Jesus is guilty of blasphemy, and that's what he's condemned to death for, what's the punishment? We've mentioned this, I think, already.
Stoning.
But how? By stoning. Okay? So if he's guilty of blasphemy, the punishment is stoning. What happens when you stone somebody? You throw rocks at them until they're dead. Okay? What happens to somebody when they get rocks start throwing at them? They fall to the ground. Okay? So what they want to condemn Jesus for would cause him to fall to the ground, become low. What he ends up being condemned for raises him up on a crucifix. So the blasphemy charge would have brought him down to the ground, but the crucifixion charge has him elevated on the cross. Again, a little irony that St. John is putting into the text. Okay. By the way, this photograph here is it's hard to see, but it's a stained glass window at a church right by where the Stations of the Cross begin. And that's Barabbas. And we'll talk about Barabbas in a second here. This is that same church. This is a stained glass window of Jesus being flogged. So Jesus is brought before Herod. Which gospel does it occur in? Luke, and only in Luke. This is not in Matthew, Mark, or John. So we need to talk about Herod for a second. So Herod is called a tetrarch. Tetra, if you remember in Greek, is the prefix for four. So this area was divided into four regions, and there was a Jewish leader, Hasmonean, relative of Herod's, put in charge of each of the four quadrants. So that's why he's called a tetrarch. So Herod's palace is in Jerusalem. He's also got charge of parts of Galilee. So Herod's got this area. He's sent by Pilate to Herod when Pilate hears he's a Galilean. Oh, which tetrarchy does he belong to? I don't want to put this guy to death. If you people are so hot and bothered about getting rid of Jesus, do it yourselves. So he sends him off to Herod. Now he knows what Herod can do and what Herod can't do. But if it's going to be the charge of blasphemy, Herod can say, yeah, kill him. He deserves blasphemy. He deserves stoning to death because he blasphemed. But Herod doesn't do that because Herod doesn't see Jesus guilty of blasphemy. He's not being put on trial in front of Herod for being a king, because Herod's not a king either, really. He's somebody who's in the Romans' back pocket. So he goes up there, and Herod doesn't see anything for him to be crucified for or killed for blasphemy, but he does mock him. And this is the only place you really see the mocking at this point in Jesus' trial in Luke's gospel. We'll see it in other places in Mark, Matthew, and John. But in Luke's gospel, this is the only place that happens. And then he sends them away with a very important sign act. A sign act is something you do, you're trying to prove a point by or send a message through. Okay? So if you've seen The Godfather, Luca Brasi sleeps with the fishes. They send the Sicilian message. It's the fish wrapped in newspaper to show that Luca Brasi is dead. That's a sign act. You're sending a message through a sign. Okay? So Herod does a sign act here. He sends Jesus back to Pilate, but he puts something on him. One translation says resplendent garb. It's meant to be a gift from Herod to Pilate. It can also be translated as a white, gorgeous robe. The Greek that's used there could be translated white, gorgeous robe. Okay, so it's a gift. It's a nice gift, but it's white. What virtue does white remind you of?
Innocent.
Jim?
Purity.
Purity. So it's almost as if Herod is saying, this is who this guy is. He's the essence of purity. He's innocent. There's nothing, we can make fun of him all we want, but he's done nothing wrong. So he sends them back with this white, gorgeous robe, or the resplendent garb. In Luke's Gospel, I think I mentioned this in the first week, the Spirit of God is present in Luke's Gospel wherever Jesus is. Okay? So after the conception of Mary's child, wherever Jesus is, that's where the Holy Spirit is in Luke's Gospel. In the Acts of the Apostles, Luke part 2, is wherever the church is, that's where the Holy Spirit is. But in the Gospels, wherever Jesus is, that's where the Holy Spirit is. So even in his trial, what is Jesus' presence doing? The text said, Herod and Pilate became friends from that day. It wasn't just because of the gift, it's because of the presence and action of Jesus. Jesus is bringing enemies together, even in his passion and death. This is a literary device that St. Luke is using to show who Jesus is for his audience. That even in his passion and death, he's changing things. There's another literary device that's used throughout Luke's Gospel, and it's called the Lucan Reversal. I might have mentioned this at one point in a homily, but it's not the homily's job to teach all these things. There's a Lucan Reversal. The things that you expect to happen, just the opposite happens. For example, the story of the Good Samaritan. The guy's beat up is up on the side of the road. The priest and the Levite, who you would expect to do the right thing, don't. The person you expect not to do the right thing, the Samaritan, does. That's a Lucan Reversal. What you expect is not what happens. Okay? If you read the Magnificat, the Blessed Mother's canticle of praise, after she appeared, she goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth. You've brought the mighty down. You've lifted up the lowly. It's a whole series of Lucan reversals. A whole series of what you expect to be happening doesn't. Look at Luke's Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are the poor? No. Having money is a gift from God. Those are the people that are blessed. Blessed are those who are weeping. Blessed are those who are weeping. Raise your hand if you feel blessed when you're weeping. Lucan reversal all over the place. Even the Beatitudes, blessed are, and then the woe-tos. And who are the woe-tos? The people who are well-fed, the people who are happy. Wait a minute, woe to them? It's like backwards. This is the Lucan reversal. So constantly in the Gospel of Luke, Luke is turning things around from the way you expect them to be. What do you expect between Herod and Pilate? This animosity. What happens because of Jesus now? Just like all those other examples? Just the opposite of what you expect. Herod and Pilate become friends from that day. So constantly, because the Holy Spirit is working in Jesus, constantly things are turning out different than we expect them to be, but the right way. Okay? So this is one of those Lucan reversals. Another interesting thing, another interesting literary device. Look at, if you want to have some fun with this, go back and look at what happens between Herod and John the Baptizer. And then look what happens between Herod and Jesus. Okay? Herod wants to see both of them. He wants to see John. He likes hearing what John has to say. Even though John's calling him out for adultery, he likes to hear what John has to say. He wants to see Jesus work a sign. So he's looking forward to seeing John and hearing John. He's looking forward to seeing Jesus. He doesn't find guilt or anything wrong with what they're saying or doing. Then you got this fact that because in both cases, the crowds, the influence of the crowds, John the Baptist, you remember the story? The daughter of his mistress does a dance and pleases him. He promises, because he's half drunk, he promises the world to her. She goes back and says, Mom, what should I ask for? And she says, the head of John the Baptizer on a plate. Herod doesn't want to do that. But the text tells us because of the crowds, he gives in and does it. Over here, what happens? He doesn't find guilt in John or in Jesus, but because he gives in and gives them back to Pilate. So there's a nice parallel there between what happens with Herod and John the Baptist and Herod and Jesus. Just like you see between, I mentioned this before, the trial of Jesus in Luke's Gospel and the trial of St. Stephen in Acts of the Apostles. So many similarities all the way through. So if you want to have some fun sometime, go back and look at that. Okay, then you've got the trial before Pilate part 2. This is the same chapel. This is Pilate washing his hands. Oops. Sorry. This is Pilate washing his hands. So in Mark, we have Barabbas and the custom of releasing a prisoner. Now, interesting thing, outside of the scripture passage, there's no historical evidence that there was this custom for releasing anybody. Outside this passage, there is no custom that, because we're going to turn over a criminal that we want to condemn to death just because you're Passover. That does not seem to be the case in any text that we have outside the scriptures. Interesting fact, in one of the earliest translations of the Gospel according to Matthew, we have Barabbas' first name. Anybody want to guess? Jesus Barabbas. Now, let's have some more fun with that. Anybody know what Bar-Abbas means in Hebrew? Son of the Father. Bar means son of. So Simon Bar Jonah, Simon Peter, the son of John. Mishael Bar Yonah, Michael, the son of John. Jesus Bar Abbas. Abbas is father. So who is this guy being presented as an option? Jesus, the son of the Father. Who's the one we should be releasing? Jesus, the son of the Father. Interesting that they both have the same name and title. Jesus, the son of the Father. Another interesting point. So Pilate says, which one do you want? Barabbas or Jesus? What does Pilate do right then and there by proposing that choice that he hasn't done so far in the text? Condemning Jesus as a criminal. By putting them at the same level, which one of these two do you want? They're equal in my eyes. I could care less which one you choose because they're both capital criminals. So by putting Jesus on the par with Barabbas, he is in essence saying, this guy's as bad as Barabbas. Which one do you want? Pilate calls Jesus the King of the Jews. So this is still in Mark. And the crowds are stirred up to ask for Barabbas, who is released. Jesus is then scourged. Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified. And we'll talk more about scourging and crucifixion next week. Then you have Matthew. Matthew largely, again, follows Mark, but as usual, more dramatized than Mark, with Pilate 3 times trying to release Jesus. And then we have this dream, Pilate's wife. I mentioned earlier how she's regarded in some Christian circles. Pilate's wife has this dream. What do we know about dreams? This is Matthew's Gospel. Anybody remember anything outside the Passion narrative, but it is in Matthew's Gospel, about dreams? I'll give you a hint. The beginning of Jesus' life. Joseph's dreams. So Joseph has dreams. What is being communicated to Joseph in the dreams? God's will. So remember, in Matthew, early in Matthew, the infancy narrative, God communicates his will to Joseph through dreams. What's happening now at the end of Matthew's Gospel? God is communicating his will through a dream. Have nothing to do with this innocent man. Okay? I was troubled greatly in a dream. So that's only in Matthew's Gospel. Also in Matthew's Gospel is only the washing of the hands of Pilate. Interestingly enough, there's no evidence outside of the Scriptures that Romans ever did that. that they ever washed, that the leader said, I wash my hands of this. Never done. It is, however, done all over the place, and Matthew's audience would have known this, because remember who Matthew's audience is. Who's Matthew's audience? Jewish converts to Christianity. Okay? What are they very familiar with? The Old Testament. All over the Old Testament, there's examples of people washing their hands of responsibility. It's a very Jewish thing. He has Pilate doing a very Jewish thing. If you want references, Deuteronomy 21, 6 to 8. Deuteronomy 21. And then Psalms 26, 6 and 73, 13. So Psalm 26 and Psalm 73. Those are three places you can see where there's a custom of washing your hands of responsibility among the Jewish people, the children of Israel, but not among the Romans. But Matthew has Pilate doing that now. And again, that's only in Matthew's gospel, because would the Luke's audience or Mark's audience care about that, they wouldn't have caught the connection. But Matthew's audience would. Okay, that's Matthew. Luke. Herod says, you charged him with inciting a revolt. Oh no, Pilate says, you charged him with inciting a revolt. I don't think so, neither does Herod. So the charge you're bringing against him is baloney. I know it, and so does Herod. So I'll flog him and then release him. I'll teach him a lesson, and then let him go. There's no mention of the custom of releasing, so unlike Mark and Matthew, it says there's this custom of releasing a prisoner at Passover. There's no mention of that custom in Luke, but the people asked for it nonetheless. And so Pilate releases a man who rebelled and murdered, but hands Jesus to deal with as they wished. And Luke, remember who Luke has generally been favorable to the crowds, he lessens the Roman responsibility by pinning it all on the crowds, begging for crucifixion, shouting for crucifixion. So again, this is a reversal now. The crowds who've always been favorable to Jesus now have turned on Jesus. And in fact, Luke puts them more responsible for Jesus' death than even Pilate. And finally, John. You have this custom, again, this custom that I release a prisoner at Passover. I find no guilt in Jesus. Here, the scourging happens in the middle of the trial. So unlike the scourging in Luke that happens at the end of the trial and then he goes off to be crucified, here it's happening in the middle of the trial. They go back to that, Pilate says, Ecce homo, behold the man. Remember that arch we saw that marks the spot where it's believed that happened? Again, it's like I'm trying to let him off. See how bad he looks now? See what a pathetic figure is now that I beat him and everything? Can't we just let him go? It's almost like what Pilate's trying to say. Behold the man. Really? You want me to destroy this guy? He's just thinks he's something that he's not. Pilate says to him, you take him out and crucify him, which of course they don't have the authority to do, but blasphemy laws demand his death. Pilate, as we're told, acts from fear. What is he afraid of? Well, they throw out this title, friend of Caesar. In your text, it's capitalized, isn't it? Friend of Caesar in John. It's not lowercase. So it's not like I'm saying I'm a buddy of Frank. Friend of Caesar is an actual title bestowed on people as an honor. That's why it's in capital letters. So Pilate had received this honor in being called friend of Caesar. And people know that. So they're throwing it back at him. Well, if you let him go when he's trying to replace Caesar, you don't deserve the honorary title that you have, friend of Caesar. You don't deserve this. And so Pilate's worried. Is he worried because he's about to condemn an innocent man? Is he worried because they're becoming rowdy? Is he worried because this might get back to Rome, that he let this guy go, and this guy was accused of claiming kingship? So there's a whole lot of things I'm sure that Pilate's dealing with at this point. But notice what he consistently refers to Jesus as in John's Gospel. Consistently refers to Jesus as the King. Consistently. Now remember, John's Gospel is written to refute heresies and to remind us of who Jesus is as the Son of God. So of course, Pilate's going to call him that because that's what he is. He is the King. He is the Son of God. But in all cases, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the bottom line is who finally sends him off to his death is Pontius Pilate. So to answer your question from the Creed, crucified under Pontius Pilate. So all Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, all four of them will say, yes, it's ultimately Pilate who's the immediate cause of Jesus' crucifixion. By the way, who's the formal and real cause of Jesus' crucifixion? Yeah, all of you who have your hands up and all of you who don't. All of us who don't. We are the real cause of his crucifixion. Finally, Jesus is mocked. And these are those two placards I told you were on the wall in the same area. It's the Sisters of Zion. It's right inside the Stephen Gate in the Old City now. And as you walk in, the Sisters of Zion convent's built right there. And that's where they've done the excavation, and that's where they started finding some of this evidence. It's in that area they found the Homo Arch. And so it seems to be, from all of that evidence, that this is where Pilate condemns Jesus and sends him off on his route to crucifixion. Mark and Matthew, again, no surprise, are identical in the text. There's Roman soldiers. It's inside the palace in one text, or praetorium in the other text. So again, is it the palace? Is it the Fortress Antoninus? It's the praetorium, we don't know. The whole cohort, the whole army group is there. They take the military cloak, the purple cloak, and they put it on him. They put the crown of thorns on him. Matthew adds that they put a reed in his hand. What does the reed maybe remind you of at this point? The scepter, yep. And they're shouting at him, "Hail, King of the Jews," and spitting on him, striking with the reed, and then they lead him off to crucifixion. That's Mark and Matthew. John, similar. There's the Roman soldiers. They don't say where this is happening in John's Gospel. There's the purple cloak, the crowning with thorns, and the "Hail, the King of the Jews," and the striking him, just like in Matthew and Mark. Luke, by the way, as I said before, doesn't have this mocking scene by the Romans because he has that included in the text with Herod, by Herod's soldiers mocking Jesus. And then, of course, he'll have, as we'll see next week, Jesus being mocked on the cross. So the mocking of Jesus is consistent across all four Gospels, but where it happens and by whom is different in the different renditions. Okay? Totally lost? No? Okay, good. Good. Okay, in that case, I will turn it over then to your table facilitators for discussion on the questions. Thank you, Frank, for